Well, we are well into the golden calf season, and I am really excited to be doing this reality message during this time. And I think today is going to be a real blessing for you. I think it's going to probably affect the way that you think about things. I'm excited because I feel like when there's this feeling like you're swimming through this sludge during the golden calf season, there's this moment of breakthrough. We're going to talk a little bit about that today and kind of explain what it means for you, what it means for your ministry, and what it means for your life. You say, "Oh, Rabbi Q, I don't have a ministry." Oh, yes, you do have a ministry. You do have a ministry. So, at any rate, we'll go ahead and we'll just immediately jump to the board. We got to recap some stuff. Of course, you and me, we love recaps, don't we? Okay, here we go. All right. So, everyone who has been on my channel for a while has definitely gotten used to me drawing the three dots on the board. And as you know, I come along and I label my three dots, right? Come and I give it some information, right? We know about these three prescribed feasts. Notice I'm putting them in English today, meaning what? Meaning I'm probably going to be talking in terms of a Christian, right? So there's a lot going on in this season, and I want to remind you of what I mean by season really quick. Okay, so let's go ahead and we will illustrate this idea that sometime in the second month, leading all the way to sometime during Sukkot, is the flood. Okay. Furthermore, within this same season, and I think we'll put this one really thick and we'll put it in purple, there is this overarching fact that everything in this season, and we'll let's see, you know what? I'm gonna draw that a little bit different so it doesn't hurt the text. Simply we'll shoot through the T a little bit in tabernacles. Okay. And so in this season, we have an anomaly going on that all of the feast days are contained within what we call the harvest. Okay. So, and when we're talking about the harvest, in fact, let's just go ahead and stay consistent here and let's label these other colors real quick. So this is going to be the flood, right? And this is going to be the prescribed pilgrimages. Wow. Okay. Now, there is, of course, we've illustrated this before, there is a very special thing going on during this seasonal period where there is a rise, and we're going to go ahead and use this green, yeah, that green, to show a rise in the supernatural and then a decline and fall in the supernatural and then a rise back up. And so there's a trend. And then we'll go ahead and we'll illustrate as we did before using this color, a decline in something and an increase in something, and then a return back to a decline in it. And of course, we also have a label. So let's go ahead and label these real quick. So we have the green is what? Spiritual. And with the spiritual, I want you to think intuition. That's going to be a fun one to try to spell. Into. Okay. And then we have the physical, right? The physical is what? It is about ego, right? Ego. Okay. So here we have a little bit kind of an over generalized context. So what we want to do now is kind of label what is, oh yeah, we need this color here real quick. So what is the flood? It is judgment. Okay. And one of the things that occurred in the flood was death. Okay. Everything that had the neshama, the breath of life, or the ruach, the spirit, died. All flesh, basar, flesh. Okay. And when we think of basar, I want you to think of steak. Okay. So it's going to be actual like muscle and tendon, right? That's flesh. But the truth be told is that the flesh in general, as a concept in mysticism, is the ego. Okay, so all flesh died. Okay, so now let's go ahead and label these two seasons, because of course, anybody who's been following the channel for a while knows that these seasons actually have some names. So the first season is, of course, going to be wilderness, and we'll go ahead and label it this way: wilderness. Horrible W. A little bit better. The thing I don't brag about is my penmanship. Okay. And then the second one that we need to label here is going to be golden calf. So there are a couple of very important points that need to be brought forward when it comes to wilderness and golden calf. So let's talk a minute about that. So first of all, the way that I want you to think about this is I want you to think in terms of what you have read in the Bible concerning the wilderness. What do we know that we've read? That in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, it says that God allowed you to be hungry. And it doesn't say it allowed the Israelites to be hungry. It says he allowed you to be hungry. And in another place in Deuteronomy, it says, this is not being spoken for those of you who are present today, but for someone in the future. Okay, that's paraphrased, but you get my point. So we know that Deuteronomy was for somebody else. Well, let's ask a question. What generation would be more relevant to the book of Deuteronomy than any other generation? Well, let's talk about what generation it could be. Well, it could be when they actually came into the land, because there's some mentions in there about when you come into the land, when you come into the land, right? Well, what if I told you that the land is not the land of Israel? It never was. What if I told you that the land doesn't actually represent what you think it does? Well, that's for another teaching. But let's just propose that we say that it was when they actually entered the land of Canaan. So the moment that Joshua crosses the Jordan, remember the priests step their feet into the Jordan with the Ark of the Covenant, and the Jordan piles up and the people cross over on dry ground, right? So then they go and they are on the other side, prepared to take a contingent of soldiers and go and attack Jericho. Remember that? So was that the time when this Deuteronomy stuff would be applied? Well, here is the problem with that. We are not talking about a physical land if we are dealing with an internal God, eternal God. Now, don't get me wrong, there is an absolute necessity for physical prosperity. And anybody who tells you different is still under the old Anglican slash Protestant slash Catholic rule of popes, kings, and the presbytery. All erroneous heretical processes. Okay? So when we're dealing with this, I want you to think along the lines of what is promised if you keep Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 29. So why is Devarim so important? Well, interestingly enough, Devarim follows the book of Bamidbar. And Bamidbar is the unfortunate Protestant and unfortunate Catholic labeling of the book in the wilderness. In the wilderness contains a list of genealogies and numbers of certain items that were brought as donation for the construction of the tabernacle, and therefore has been very inappropriately anti-Semitically and anti-spiritually labeled the book of Numbers. Deuteronomy follows the book of Numbers, and one of the things that you need to know is the greatest shall be last, and the last shall be greatest. Well, the last book of Torah is Devarim, Deuteronomy. So what does the word Devarim mean? It means things, okay? It means items. It can mean words. In fact, the word Devar means to explicit things, right? These things were said. The 10 Commandments are the 10 things, right? But Devarim follows Bamidbar, and Bamidbar is in the wilderness. So Devarim is actually more about the golden calf season. Well, we will talk about that in a minute, because then you would be like, well, what about Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus? You know what? I love your heart and mind concerning that, but we're not going to touch upon that today. Just understand that the book of Numbers pertains to the wilderness, Bamidbar, because that's actually the name of it. How is it the name of it? Well, interestingly enough, it's actually really simple, but actually very deeply profound, because some of the things that happen in the wilderness season happen in the book of Numbers. Let me explain. During the wilderness season, you were allowed to be hungry and not be satiated. Even if you were to eat, you would not be satisfied. Second is that you would be thirsty and that you would not have it quenched. Even if you did consume something that would quench thirst, it's not quenched. And then finally, of course, there is the lack of protection, right? There is the actual allowing of an enemy to attack the weak. Oh my gosh, what a powerful, powerful thing. So the enemy attacks the weak, and of course, obviously what happens? The weaknesses of the people are exposed. Absolutely what's happening during the wilderness season, which consequently also happens to be the counting of the Omer. Now, why would this be important? Like, what is the point? The point is that the word Bamidbar is literally the first word of that book of Torah in the wilderness. In fact, every one of the first words of the book of which it is identified in Torah is simple. So we've got Bereshit, we've got Shemot, we've got Bamidbar, and we've got Devarim. But here's the amazing thing about it. They all pertain to a season, and they all pertain to something important. Now, here's the intrigue. It's just the first word of the book. So Bereshit is Genesis, right? Because Bereshit is in the beginning. What's Shemot? These are the names. Shemot, right? And that's Exodus. And then we have Leviticus, right? Because why? Because the church has decided that that letter is just to the priests, right? The Levites, right? Oh gosh, what a wonderful group of people who came up with all this junk. Okay, so Leviticus is labeled Leviticus because it's supposedly to the Levites, another anti-Semitic slur. But let's just leave that alone. Vayikra, why? Because it says, and he called. Who called? Moses was called by God to speak to the sons of Israel and explain how to do the proper slaughters. I said slaughters, that's right. The word sacrifice comes from pagan rituals in which people suffer in order for something to be accepted, right? In order for the rain to fall, in order for the crops to grow, in order for the babies to be born. So, the reason why this is all so important is because in the wilderness, Bamidbar is the book of Numbers. What follows is the book of Deuteronomy, which means Deuteronomy has a powerful, powerful reference to the golden calf season. You say, well, wait a minute, the golden calf season actually occurs in the book of Exodus. No, actually, it does not. The narrative concerning the golden calf occurs in the book of Exodus. But if you timeline the word Exodus to what it is supposed to be, Exodus basically goes from the moment that they are in the wilderness to the moment when they are not in the wilderness. Consequently, the premise would be that Exodus leads from Egypt all the way to the promised land. But as you know, the Exodus ends with the construction of the tabernacle. Again, Torah is what? The inspired or breathed, God breathed, that's what Paul said. It is God breathed. Okay? Now, the reason why that is so important is because you need to understand that the Torah itself is a foundation of all things created, of all things that should be done, all natural order processes, etc., are all a mechanism of the creation of the universe in Torah. Now, I know that that's difficult for some non-mystical people to accept, and of course, a lot of people think that Torah is very biased, conservative, promotes inequality, promotes racism, etc., etc., etc. But there's a misidentification and a misunderstanding of Torah. So why is that so important? Because now we can accept that it was set up this way on purpose, that the wilderness season, as it were, pertains to in the wilderness. And there's a lot of things in Numbers that would pertain to the wilderness season. But the intrigue is that finally we come to the very end. We're finally to the place where we're about to enter into the promised land. And as you all know, I also label these 3 feast days, as they're called, these appointed times, as they're called, which is still an inappropriate interpretation of the word Moedim. These 3 cycles, oh, beautiful interpretation. Okay, so the premise is that these 3 cycles or these 3 seasons have something to do with the bride of God, okay? And so let's go ahead and label those really quick in order to kind of understand some other deeper elements of this. So let's see, what color have we not used? I think we'll go ahead and go with pink here real quick. I just kind of decided today that I want to use all the colors of the rainbow. All right, here we go. So we are going to go with, this is called the Shidduchim. Shidduchim. And the Shidduchim is the matchmaking, okay? And then we'll go ahead and put that there. Matchmaking. Now, why am I using the format, why am I switching the format up here? I want you to think about this. Why am I putting the Hebrew words of the wedding steps instead of the English? It is because there is a depth to the pink, since we're using pink to represent this lady, this bride of God. Okay, the next is going to be Pentecost, which is what the Erusin. Oh, I do it every time. I always switch the R and the U. You know why? It's because of the word Europe. Erus. Okay, and the Erusin is the betrothal. Betrothal. And those of you who have been on this channel know that I can't spell. Oh no, that's what I was going to say. Those of you who have been on this channel know that these are the actual steps that the bride of Yahweh goes through. Okay, and then finally we have the Nisasim. Nicene, and the Nicene is the ratification. Okay, all right, and then we'll continue to use our theme, our pink theme here. And when we do, what we're going to do is we are going to kind of understand what's happening during the season. So in this case, we're going to label this spiritual moment beautification. I'm going to label this moment, we'll call it the patience. Well, no, actually, I'm going to do one better. We're going to call this endurance of the saints. Okay, endurance of the saints. So, what is happening during the beatification? There is a bridal preparation of the bride in which she is basically going from the moment where the bridegroom notices her to the moment of betrothal. In between that time is a time of presentation. She's showing the beauty of her light, right? And so that season is designed for the beautification of the bride. And what is the endurance of the saints? Well, there's a number of things. First of all, your adversity will become your strength. You will eventually get through a season that is adverse. You will get through a season, and how you get through that season is something called endurance. Okay, so getting through endurance, or I'm sorry, getting through an adverse season with or through endurance is basically kind of going to become a strength of yours. You will say, oh yeah, been there, done that, bought the t-shirt and the hat, right? I have already experienced that and I know how to get through it. Well, interestingly enough, that usually does not stay quiet, and that usually does not stay dormant, and that usually does not stay hidden under a basket. You say, oh, wow, did you just really do that? Yes, I did. Your light, your strength has come from your adversity. And the dark days of your life have become the light of men. Now watch this. Now what happens? Your strength becomes your expertise. What does that mean? That means that you end up being the authority on the subject as a result of the experience and the how to endure, right? That endurance has taught you how to encounter that foe, deal with that foe, and move on. Let me give you an example. Considering the fact that my demographic is generally those over the age of 40, I can remind you guys of the little 8-bit game, Super Mario Brothers. Super Mario Brothers, of course, is a game that's kind of a levels game where you run through a level, you get through a bunch of different conflicts and things that entertain your brain because you're solving a problem and you're solving a puzzle, right? But back in the day, it was really difficult to do because the moment you turn the machine off and you turn it back on, you had to go through the levels again to get back to where you were. I think eventually some of the later versions within that same game system before that system upgraded provided you with an opportunity to save. But even then, there was something that felt great about running back through a level, jumping over the turtle, hitting the coin, finding the hidden thing, and you already know where everything's at. There was something that felt good about it because you were conquering it, right? You had already conquered it. Now you're dominating it. Well, that's all has to do with your ego and a number of other things. But the point being is that you became an expert at that level. Well, what does that mean? That means now your cousin comes over and you're going to sit down with the controllers and they're going to go, why? Because they already fell off the thing that you already know how to jump over, right? Now they got to learn how to run and jump and catch the thing and run up the vine, right? Those things are now your expertise. And you can say, here, you just got to do this with the buttons really quick and just jump here. And there's a hidden vine there, right? That kind of thing is what we would call an expertise. So now your expertise is, I've been there, done that. I know the way to get through this. Well, guess what? That's your ministry, whether you like it or not. And we're going to get into whether you like it or not. In fact, this message should not have been labeled you, but should have been labeled whether you like it or not. And we're going to get into that. But what I want you to see is that the golden calf is the season of endurance. So let me illustrate for you why we call it the season of the golden calf. Because in the beginning, there is definitely something that was very true. When we first started exploring the season of the golden calf, because to my knowledge, there has not really been anybody who has addressed these seasons except this ministry, and I'll tell you why. A couple of friends of mine got together and we began to notice that there was a pattern after Passover every year. There was just this really feeling like almost like God was like not speaking, feeling like the Bible was dry, feeling like everything was just really difficult. And, you know, humans at large, when they go through adversity, have a tendency, because it is a mechanism built into the universe, to determine that what is happening is something they deserve. Okay. And desert is a big part of reality. In fact, the ens legis that we in America have created in order to establish rights and laws and all other things. And an ens legis is a fictitious person. And the fictitious person we've established in jurisprudence, we apply all these laws and all these rights to determine whether or not it's a right that should be applied, et cetera, et cetera. Let me give you an example. The Roe v. Wade. The reason why the word Roe was used is because Roe was a fictitious person who was assumed to have certain rights and had to follow certain laws, okay, and was not actually a legitimate person. There was an actual person involved in the case, but the representation was, here's a fictitious person and we are challenging this law, right? We're challenging these precepts. Okay, so the reason why I bring this up is because that's a personification as well. Now, when we're dealing with the context of endurance and the golden calf season, the way that I want you to think about it is that the Torah presents a personification that ends up being kind of an identification of this context. Because between the Erosine and the Nizasine, something very specific is happening. Um, the 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 bride is left alone to um to basically um end up in kind of a season of waiting for the man to have a position or space prepared for her to become the team that they would be in the tradition of this wedding step. He leaves and actually goes and does an add-on to his father's house, or he creates some another house on the land that his father owns, or they have a tent and they create a tent. For example, with Isaac, Isaac took Rebekah into his mother's tent because why? Because Sarah was gone. And so there was already a tent available. Um, and so the way I want you to think about this is until that space or that time or that dimension is prepared, the bride has to endure aloneness. We'll get to that in a minute. She has to be taken, but not already in the home. In fact, betrothal at large would be that you are married to the person, but you don't yet dwell with them. And there can be variations of that. There can be variations where it's that you still would see them in the marketplace. You still would see them. In fact, you might even still spend time with them, but you can't go into that space yet. You can't go into the marriage chamber. Okay. So this personification of a bride of God, so to speak, is obviously very anthropomorphic and is descriptive of energies that are occurring, but that's kind of another story. But the golden calf season has an illustration in Torah that is very relevant and important. So as we have this fictitious person represented in this going to prepare a place or going to create a space of process, right? We have a personification of that in Torah, and that is that Moses leaves. Okay, so watch how this works. The intensification of all power in the universe stuffed into a perceivable God comes down, lights the place up, the mountain's hovering, the mountain's exploding, there's fire and lightning and thunder and shofars and all kinds of other stuff going on. And they say, whoa, Moses, you go in there and talk to that thing, right? It's because there was this cloud. And so boom, Moses goes into this cloud and ascends the mountain. And of course, they say, as for this Moses, we don't know what happened to him, right? Why? Because they are not in that state of endurance. Okay. Now, I want you to think about this. Moses has left to go get something, something that they thought if they heard they would die. Well, that was definitely true because why? Because what happens next actually initiates an actual cyclical process within nature, the universe, and spirituality itself. And that is that as Moses leaves, there's a decline here, right? There's a movement away from this spiritual high. As that occurs, there's an increase here in ego, an increase in solving the problem on your own, because obviously, whatever it is that we thought this was, it's not. Now, I can tell you, just because I'm preaching about it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect me. It absolutely affects me. In fact, I can tell you that those questions came up in my mind this week. Why am I continuing in this ministry? What's the point? Right? Oh, those are golden calf words. As for this Moses, where has he come from? What are the words here? God must not care. What are the words here? I am tired of waiting on the promise. That's how you word this. You say, you know what? I don't think even if God was going to bless me, he doesn't want to, right? If he's capable of it, sure, but he's just not doing it. And then of course here is like, really? We're still waiting for that to occur? Like, come on. I got an idea. Why don't I go start my own thing? Let me go initiate my own process. Let me make this happen. Well, what is that? That's all ego, which is what we talk about right there, right? Okay, so now what we really got to do is understand the personification here. Moses goes to prepare a place. Prepare what place? A space in which the teaching and instruction of God can be contained within the power of the human being. As you know, my ministry and what I understand about that is that he did not go up on the mountain and get shown how to build a square rectangle building, but instead saw the transfiguration of Yeshua. That's when he was with Yeshua on the mountain, as while he was up there for those 40 days and 40 nights. And of course, that time transcendence is totally possible because it's Yeshua, right? Okay, so the premise is that what he saw was the glorified body of Christ. Now go down the mountain and create that in this people. Yeah, right. Okay, and of course, what does Yahweh say? He says, look, they've already started their BS. Go down there and fix that. And of course, he goes down there, throws the stones on the ground, and goes and hacks up the people and all the other stuff that happened with the golden calf. But what was the golden calf? The golden calf was them saying, you know what, we don't really want to wait to learn this mysticism. We're just going to create it ourselves. And so what do we know? Well, we know that there was actually a god of certain things in Egypt. Each element of reality was some sort of worship of a specific deity. For example, the Nile was a god and the sky was a god, etc., etc. Well, there was a golden calf. There was a calf that was represented in the Egyptian deities and pantheon. So of course they create this thing and they come up with this idea and they do all these things. And of course, what do humans do when they decide that they just don't want to follow Torah? The first thing they do is sexual immorality. Oh, wait a minute. That's actually what James and the Jerusalem Council wrote to the Gentiles who were coming into Torah. Don't commit sexual immorality. Defined by what? Okay, well, let's see. Was it, I don't know. Was it sex before marriage? That's sexual immorality. That's got to be sexual immorality, right? Because that is definitely forbidden in Torah. No, it's not forbidden in Torah. What is commanded in Torah is that if you seduce a woman and she is consenting, then you have to marry her. If you go into her, you're married. And that is how you treat her, and that is what you have to offer her. Okay? Well, guess what? That would be a very interesting list of wives for a majority of the men from my generation. But the point being is that that's not sexual immorality. So where's sexual immorality defined? Well, according to Torah, it's in Leviticus, right? Where it says you can't do these things. Well, here is the interesting thing about it. You're supposed to abstain from sexual immorality. So what do? They rise up to play, right? Okay, we could get into all kinds of things about this Hebrew word play, not the English word play, but the Hebrew word that's represented there in the Torah of what it was. But as you can see, one of the things that they do instantaneously is they begin to identify with the culture who had the God in the first place. They say, okay, this is how we worship this God. And they even say, this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. So you can see the construct of the golden calf is basically a self-initiation. Well, where is that coming from? Remember the red line. Red line is ego. Look, that line right there, just like this line right here, is actually the what we would call the apex or the climax or the extreme of the seasons, right? So this is the spiritual high, this is the physical low, which would be the ego low. Why? Because I can tell you right now, when you're hungry, you're a little bit more humble. Are you a little bit more angry? Sure, but you're a little bit more humble. And what I mean by that is you feel a little bit more like somebody needs to provide it for you, right? And so we remember our God. And of course, it says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Well, what was that for this season? No, that was them to learn for this season. Why? Because the season before the season is always your learning experience. You have your learning experience, and then you have your ministry or your responsibility or your purpose. Learning experience, purpose. Learning experience, purpose. Well, here we're coming along, and instead of doing what we're supposed to do here, which is what? To become humble, to become small, to become quiet during the season, we rise up to play. And not only do we rise up to play in the sense of that thing that I talked about with what they did with the golden calf. So all they did is they said, okay, what do we know? Well, we know how to make a god. That's easy, right? So we will construct the statue that we're going to worship, and then we'll worship it in the way that it's supposed to be worshiped. Not how Yahweh wanted to be worshipped, but how you have the traditional worship of the golden calf. Okay. And then it seasonally occurs again with Jeroboam. Remember last week when we talked about Jeroboam and all that? Okay. So now I think one of the things that we need to kind of identify is, what did Yeshua say about the golden calf? What did he say about the prophetic seasons? And when I say prophetic, let me explain something here. I am not using the word prophetic the way that a Christian, charismatic, date-setting idiot who buys into the rapture junk does. I'm saying prophetic from the sense of what proceeded out of the mouth of the prophets, which was not future prediction, but instead was a setting of reality as a result of their determination or judgment, which we're going to get into in a minute, of that season, of that people, of that process. For example, when Jonah goes to Nineveh and it tells them that they need to repent or God's going to destroy the land, of course, they all repent, right? Which was a shock to him. But that means that what he said was not concrete. He went to Nineveh and said, God is going to destroy this land, right? So now all of a sudden we have this destruction of Israel, and now all of a sudden people think that prophetic means future predictions. No, it doesn't. It is an establishment of a judge, because a prophet is a judge of a land. They come in, they see the injustices, and they decide what should happen. And that's what makes them so powerful, is because they have the ability through dominion and through the activation of energies to actually determine the what is going to happen next to a land as a result of the injustices they perceive. Watch out watch out for prophets. And when I say watch out for prophets is do not cross them. Listen, the stupidest thing that anybody ever did was turn Yeshua away in a city. And he says to you, woe to you, Chorazin and Capernaum, for if you knew the time of your visitation, right? But instead, it will be better for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment. Well, guess what? They're all destroyed. And consequently, a majority of those cities that he said that about ended in violence. Okay, so now we need to move into the context of the bride, the pink, right? So what's happening here? The endurance of the saints. Let's explain that a little bit. So what's happening in the timeline? What we're looking at here is the idea that from the time of Pentecost, well, let's just say a little bit before Pentecost, in the time of Yeshua, at Passover, he told them, I go to prepare a place, right? Well, interestingly enough, anybody who was Hebrew would have understand the idiomatic thought process there, that we're going to personify a bride, and you disciples here sitting at this table with me, eating the bread with me, the ones I just washed your feet, are the bride. So I'm going to personify the bride. You represent the bride. I represent what? The husband. And so I'm going to go prepare a place, which means I'm going to create some interdimensional time and space purpose for your reality. Okay. And so then after that, what does that mean? Well, what he's telling them is it's going to be a while, right? Because in the Hebrew idiomatic understanding of going and preparing a place is that the son does not get to know when he gets to go get his bride. The son actually has to prepare the place, get the house ready, do all of the things, work the work, you know, do the family business or whatever it is that he's involved in. And there will be a time where the father will have determined that he's ready, that the place is ready. Okay, go get your bride, right? And so then he goes and brings his bride into his house. How dense do you have to be to realize that those are all anthropomorphic, idiomatic references to energies? God is spirit. Now, are we stupid enough in our function to try to assign that to mean air? You know, like when you have a pneumatic actuator, what's going on? You're having an air move a piston back and forth, pneumatic. Pneuma is the word for spirit in the Greek. And so are we really going to do that? Are we really going to try to make this some sort of really, really ethereal, otherworldly thing? Or are we going to accept that there is actually a general concentrated energy here on this earth known as the Holy Spirit, which consequently that word kadosh, no matter what you do to it, has all of the references for a given understanding of polarization, of synchronization, and of energy process. You know, there's some time in your life when you're going to have to accept that part of your reality is the fact that you are actually a very, very powerful eternal being. And that very powerful eternal being has been stuffed into a very temporal process. Okay? All right. So when we're dealing with the golden calf season, one of the biggest things that we need to accept is that endurance is the key. Now, there are two ways to end up in a state of endurance, and I'll explain those in a minute. And I want you to understand that the unfortunate thing here is that what you think you understand about this incident, you don't. What you don't understand is the process by which the people wanted to draw Moses back. They wanted to bring Torah down because it's built into them to bring Torah down from heaven, right? So that it would be here on earth. Now, I don't expect you to understand the mysticism behind the golden calf, but I do expect you to understand that your soul has a mechanism within it. And that mechanism is that when you get off a path, what your soul does is it activates sin. If you read Romans chapter 7 correctly, you will see that something was awakened within Paul. Paul says, I do what I don't want to do. The things that I want to do, I don't do, right? What does that mean? That means his heart was pure in his desire to do the right thing. Did that end up as proof of concept? No, it did not, because there was something else, a mechanism within him that was actually working against the process. What was that? It was his soul creating a correction, okay? Because course correction is a huge part of getting to the destination correctly, okay? And so when we have deviated, the first thing that happens is your soul activates a desire and indulgence within you, which causes you to be drawn so deep into it that it can become loathsome. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. So the people are in the wilderness, and here's the irony. If you really want to understand a culture, understand that they left, and when they left Egypt, one of the things that Moses went and did is he said, "Look, we got to take the women and children." And Pharaoh's like, "Okay, you can take the women and children, but leave the livestock." Right? And he's like, "No, we got to take the livestock because we got to go sacrifice." Well, first of all, of course, you don't understand sacrifice, but let's just go ahead and go with that. We got to go sacrifice. So finally, when they leave Egypt, not only did they take all the riches of Egypt with him, but they take all the livestock that survived the hail and the pestilence. They take all of that with them as well. So now they're in the wilderness with all this steak, right? All these steaks and spare ribs and tenderloin, and they say, God brought us out here in the wilderness to die. There were what? There were onions, or there were leeks and garlic in the flesh pots. Bro, you got mutton, you got steak, you got chicken, right? What's your problem, right? And so the premise is that now all of a sudden out in the middle of nowhere, they're like, oh, we don't have any food. So what do? He rains down manna from heaven, a food that their fathers had never known. And as soon as they crossed the Jordan, the manna ceased. Now they come to the golden calf season. They're like, man, and now I know that there's a little bit of a timeline difference here, but I want you to understand it's a golden calf season because what happens? The manna has become loathsome, right? All we have is this manna to eat. Okay. So the premise is that what we really need to get our minds wrapped around then is the concept of gratefulness. That plays a big role here, but there's something else, and we're going to get into it pretty significantly today. Did the people know that they were committing sin? The Talmud, Rambam, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, all very famous rabbis, all wrote on the subject of the golden calf. And the consensus was that the 9th of Av, which was about 3 weeks after the golden calf, was the result of the golden calf, and it was designed so that the people would never rejoice in that season. Now, let's say that those rabbis are right. Let's say that, like what I talked about last week, where we have this reality, we have this moment where we need to accept that when there is proof historically of the significance of a date, we should probably look at the divine significance. And so the premise is that the 9th of Av has been the activation of horrible things that have happened to Jewish people. Go back to the video last week and understand what the word Jewish means. The things that have happened to the Jewish people, okay? And the 9th of Av and the activation of calamities with the Jewish people has been significant in the sense of its connection specifically to them and the golden calf, and their rabbis agree. So when we see Yeshua say, the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses, therefore do what they say, but do not do as they do, because they say and they do not do. And what he means by that is that they give instruction and they expect you to carry out that instruction, and that's good. But don't be like them where they give instruction, but they themselves don't practice what they preach. Oh, if you understood all of the information contained in that chapter about rabbis, you would understand that we are supposed to take the Talmud seriously, but with a grain of salt. And so when we are looking at things, because I know there's some foul stuff about Yeshua and Talmud, and the rabbis who wrote that are probably the ones who are experiencing the thing that they said Yeshua was experiencing, if that type of a place even exists, which I doubt it does. So in principle, the rabbis say that the world is affected by this season, this ninth of Av season. That the Jews would never rejoice during this time because they would always know that it was the time when they refused to go into the promised land, and it's the time when this happened. And why is that so important? Because this is a construct, but you don't understand. This is a spell, okay? This is a spell, all right? So when we are working with knowledge, it is very important to understand that just because somebody says that something is true doesn't make it true. And just because somebody has an expertise in a subject and says that something is true doesn't make it true. And just because somebody has a claim that they have divine guidance and say that something is true doesn't make it true. Meaning what? Who told you that something was true? Because if you're sitting in a pew on Sunday morning and listening to a preacher speak something to you does not make it true because he went to seminary school. Okay? It does not make it true because he has been a experienced pastor for a number of years. It doesn't make it true because he's an overseer or a bishop or a cardinal or a pope. Meaning what? You need to be very, very, very careful when it comes to the divine, when it comes to the spiritual. Let me illustrate this for you, okay? There is no way that someone who prospers off of the back of others is going to ever tell those whose backs are bearing the burden that's causing them to prosper that they themselves could be the owner of a business or the king of a country. There's no benefit there. So now if I'm going to communicate to these people something spiritual, I'm going to make sure that they never, ever get the idea in their head that they should quit their job and go and do their skill and actually make me pay them a lot more money than what I'm paying them right now because they're an actual contractor than a wage earner. There's no benefit in me doing that. There's no benefit in me telling an employee, hey, you know what? You actually should go start your own business, because then they become the competitor. Enter King James, who offered to the people this divine servant of God a translation into the English language of the ancient Hebrew scripts. Here you go, people. Here's this thing. But somewhere along the lines, we have to accept that a king is never going to tell his peasants that they could be kings. So the reason why I talk about construct and the reason why I talk about spell is because what you got to understand is that you don't understand how the supernatural works because of what you have been told. You've been told that this is exactly how the supernatural works and this is how you're supposed to respond to it. But you've never been told about the energies, and you've never been told about the workers of darkness who do things to alter the natural order processes of nature in order to influence human behavior for a malevolent purpose. You want to talk about a satanic cabal? Fine. I promise you, they are more powerful than any one church of people. Let's say 75 people in a church worshiping God and listening to a sermon, and 75 people in a satanic cabal activating spells. And you tell me what's more prevalent in this country right now. Now, I am not one to accept these conspiracies about this global group that are trying to run the world, because the last time somebody tried to pull that, God confounded their language. But what I can say is that somebody who knows how to activate energies in an inappropriate way is more powerful than somebody who's been told how to be spiritual. Okay? And you need to also know and understand that that results in some really unfortunate things, because now they're told, oh, yeah, all you got to do is in the name of Jesus, tell this person and that will cast out the demon, right? And how many people go and try to do that, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work, and therefore their faith is damaged. And you say, well, what about that story where Yeshua said, oh, it just goes out by prayer and fasting? Oh, that was a gloss. That's only in like one manuscript, and it's a newer manuscript than the older manuscripts. And don't buy into the hogwash that you see on YouTube where these quote unquote textual critic experts go and say, oh, well, there was this newer manuscript, and what happened is they put the stuff in there because it was missing from the other one, but the information was true. If y'all really buy that, maybe you should be sitting in the pew on Sunday morning parroting whatever your pastor says. So what we're working with here is basically an activation of energies, but they are false energies. And it was so effective that it affected humanity all the way into the future, where a defunct wannabe idiot artist with a little bit of charisma and a really good ability to speak ends up trying to take over the world. And in the process comes up with an idea. Let's just kill all the Jews. Let's hunt them down. Let's find them and let's kill them. That's the solution. 9th of Av. 3 weeks after the golden calf. And the rabbis see it as enough of a significance after the destruction of the first temple, in which Nebuzaradan, the general for Nebuchadnezzar, comes in and rips the other temple down and burns it to the ground. And then again in 70 AD, during the death of the Zealots and the downfall of the Jewish nation at large, again, we have not coincidence. But how does that affect the rest of us, the rest of the world, or for lack of, because I'm obviously Jewish, so I kind of fall into that category. But the premise is that how does that affect the world at large when we're dealing with these things? Well, look at what happened in World War II. The entire world was affected by the darkness of that entire anti-Semitic process. Okay. But what you miss is the soul of Torah in this story and in this process. So Westerners are probably the most powerful meditators in this world. Now, some of you just said, right? Because you think, well, Eastern mysticism and Eastern spiritual practices are more about meditation. I mean, look at the Muslims, how many times a day they pray, right? Look at the monks, the Buddhist monks. Look at the Franciscan monks, right? We have a monastery near us, and the Franciscan monks have this time of silence in which they do their work and actually kind of do it in a meditative manner. Well, it's interesting because actually there is a premise here and a process here that people just can't get their minds wrapped around. They don't realize that's what they're doing. If you are driving your car to work and when you get to work, you realize that you don't know how you got there. Let me tell you what you've been doing. You've been meditating. You've been in a trance state. Now, my hypnosis professor was actually the first one to actually point this out to me. But basically, the context, the idea is that what happens is that when we are doing something that is repetitious, we will have a tendency to do it subconsciously so that our mind can occupy other things. Okay. Now you say, well, why would a brain do that? Oh, now we're getting into something good. You see, you asked the why, we're starting to get into the understanding, right? Remember, understanding, Bina, is the what and the why, and the wisdom is the who and the how, right? Okay, so we're in the what and the why. Why would somebody do that? Oh, that's a beautiful question, but let's continue. So the premise is you drop into a trance 1 or trance 2, because trance 3, you lose control of your body. You actually become paralytic. So in trance 3, it's a little bit harder to move around. But in trance 1 and 2, you do have an ability to move around. And that's usually the level that hypnotists, like street hypnotists, take people to, is trance 1 or 2, because you still need them to be able to bark like a dog, or wiggle, or walk around like a chicken. Trance 3, they would start to lose that capacity, right, as they start to drop into the deeper trances. So the premise is that you can actually drive a car, which is a repetitious action, right? You can drive a car to and from work because you know the directions, you know the map, you know all the stuff. And usually, depending on how careless you are, because it's one of the things is your mind learns the shortcuts. So if you pull up to a stop sign and don't stop and do a rolling stop, your subconscious is going to do a rolling stop. And the reason for that is because your subconscious mind says, oh, that's a shortcut. Okay, good. We don't have to stop all the way. That's great. And so you actually will come to a rolling stop instead of a regular stop while you're in trance. So the premise is that as you are driving and you are moving towards your destination, your mind is already pre-programmed to follow the traffic laws, pre-programmed to pay attention to the taillights, pre-programmed to pay attention to the lanes, pre-programmed to pay attention to the signs, etc., etc. But you don't remember driving, you don't remember getting there. Okay, and so now you get to work and you go in, and all of a sudden some sort of reality hits, and now you're out of the trance. Well, guess what? That's meditation. Whatever you were thinking about during that time, which you may or may not remember because you were in trance, is actually what you were meditating on. You ever been in a conversation and you start to think about something, and now all of a sudden you all of a sudden are back in the conversation, and you just realize the person was just talking for like a good 2 or 3 minutes and you have no idea what they said, and you could probably try to go back and remember what they said, but what do you say instead? You say, what did you say? Right? Because you were in trance. And as you're in trance, you are in that process of processing information. Well, let me tell you what Westerners are meditating upon: their fears and their doubts. And we're going to get into this. But the premise is that during those moments when they're processing these fears and doubts, what they are doing is they're trying to figure out how to create a construct or solution to it. They're running through a conversation that they may have had, an argument that they may have had, or whatever in their head. They're meditating on it. They're trying to figure out how they could have done it different or whatever, because they're conflict solving, or they're trying to fix the gap. Okay. And the premise behind it has to do with hunger, and the premise behind it has to do with satiation. Okay, so they're hungry for a solution. And so here's the crazy part about it: you will actually remember the unsolved things more than you will remember the solved things. Now, it's interesting because here's one of the things I want you to think about. Let's go into a verse in the New Testament, a very important verse, actually. And I think that it is one of those verses that we really need to take into consideration when it comes to the what's the word I'm thinking of? The mechanism of meditation. Okay. And remember, I said something about spells and other things here, and I'm gonna get into that. Okay. So in order to do that, let's just jump over to this verse here. Didn't mean to jump to the board, I meant to jump there. Okay. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is good of good repute, if there is any excellence and if there is any worthy of praise, anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. Let's try a different version of this. Let's do the Amplified, because of course this is like a beautiful, beautiful set of words. And what the Amplified does is it takes the idiomatic pieces and adjusts them to greater phrases and greater interpretation of what is actually being said. Okay, finally, brethren, I'm not going to say believers because that is not what the word brethren means in Hebrew understanding. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable and worthy of respect, whatever is right and confirmed by God's word, whatever is pure and wholesome, whatever is lovely and brings peace, whatever is admirable and of good repute. If there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think continually on these things. Center your mind on them and implant them in your heart. In the King James, I will read it to you really quick. I'm not going to share it with you. I'm just going to read it really quick. That last part actually says, and this is, of course, Philippians 4:8. The end is to meditate. I'm sorry, it's the New King James. Meditate on these things. So meditation, meditation is a context of focus. Okay. You stop and you think on something, and the thing that you think on is actually going to be your focus. And your focus is actually going to be the thing that comes into your life. Now, there's two reasons why this is important. The first is because your focus creates the attraction, and I will get to that in a minute. The second is that your focus creates your perception of reality. Okay? Okay, so there's a number of ways that I want to go about this. The first one is, as I think I want to go ahead and use some context from some things that I've been learning this week about color grading. I'm going to get into that. And then also I want to talk a little bit about what we would mistakenly call the law of attraction, in the sense of course, the lady who channels and says that, oh, hey, this guy Abraham contacted me and blah, 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 blah. There's actually somebody who brought this stuff to our understanding a long time before Abraham and this lady came along. And that is basically that this is what Yeshua taught. And these are the things that he explained. He said, if you ask for something in my name, believe that you have received it. Okay. Now let me tell you what the mistake that people make with this. He did not say set it and forget it. That's a mistake. And that is not how you are supposed to do this. Okay. So you don't say, okay, you know what? Let's say that we make it simple. I need $20 to buy some food. Okay. So what I do is I make a cardboard sign and I sit down on the corner, on a street corner, and I put on there $20 for food. If somebody comes along and gives me a $20 bill, I have demonstrated the entire process of manifestation. Now, manifestation, unfortunately, is another word that Christians are scared of because their pulpit has said that it's witchcraft. And I'm here to tell you that that is exactly what Yeshua said. He said, if you want something, ask for it and believe that you have received it already. Well, we're going to work on that a little bit because I'm going to tell you the mistake that people make. Number one, Christians make the mistake of overlooking this obvious manifestation process. Number two, New Agers make the mistake of not realizing that it is Yeshua who is speaking. And therefore, there needs to be an understanding that Yeshua is actually a Messiah in their lives, a people mover, a status changer, and there's other things that apply to Yeshua, and they shouldn't be so jaded by the word Christ and should get their minds wrapped around this amazing person who gave some amazing information and just so happens to be the soul of the very document that created the universe. Fair enough. Think of Torah as a script, okay? So Torah is a script of how reality is supposed to exist. But remember, this teaching is about you. And when I said reality, when I preached about reality last week, I said, hey, look, here's the reality of things. Here's what you need to stop doing. You need to stop pretending. Well, there's an interesting thing concerning pretending, right? Pretending is exactly what Yeshua told you to do. He said, if you want something, ask it in my name, and then believe that you have received it, and you will receive it. You know, there's entire books like this thick written on manifestation, and that's one singular verse in Mark chapter 7, I think it is. Now, why is this so important? Well, Paul does something interesting here. I'm going to give you some context with this. And in fact, I'm going to go back into the Amplified. We'll go ahead and put it on the screen because I think it is something where we could really benefit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an Amplified Bible on one side and the New King James on the other so that we can get that word meditate in there. And any of you that are like, oh, you shouldn't be picking and choosing between versions, you know what? Shut up. It's not even supposed to be in the English. You're supposed to be speaking Hebrew because that's the language your God chose to communicate his information to you. I mean, you just got to get over that. And really, I mean, I'm just the messenger. So don't shoot the messenger. All right. So here we go. All right. So let's see. Let's go to. So here's the first one. Rejoice in Yahweh always. Delight, take pleasure in him. Again, I will say rejoice. Rejoice in Yahweh always. And again, I will say rejoice. Okay. But then in verse 5, it says, let your gentle spirit, your graciousness, your unselfishness, your mercy and tolerance and patience be known to all men. Let your gentleness be known to all men. Yahweh is at hand. And now, of course, here the Lord is near. But now here in verse 6, it says in the New King James, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Okay. Now, before we go any further, I would like to explain some things about thankfulness. Okay. The first one, and I think this is a really important one, is that in Hebrew understanding, thankfulness are just words. In fact, you can say Todah, but you don't realize what is actually being said in the word Todah. You see, when you thank somebody and you're gracious to them, it's an ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle context. Okay, so there are five systematic tenets of the ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle that Abraham established. Okay. So we're not going to get into those, but the last one, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. The last one is the most important one, and that is hospitality. So let me explain to you how hospitality works. In its simplicity, hospitality is an offering of food, drink, lodging, comfort, and visitation. All the things that Yeshua mentioned when he said, you give me drink, you visited me while I was in prison, et cetera, are all part of that process. But here's an important part. In return for those things, you always pronounce a blessing. Okay? Okay. So the way I want you to think about this is when we are when we do something for somebody, or we offer some sort of a context of I don't know, a service or a food or something like that. It is usually the result of the fact that they themselves either A, cannot provide it for themselves, or B, we are offering it as some sort of act of friendship or act of relationship. Okay. So the way that I want you to think about this is that anytime that you do something that is of a service, or provide a food or a sustenance or some sort of thirst quenching item, you're going to be responded to with the words thank you. Okay. Thank you. Now, thank you is just words. And what I mean by that is there's nothing in there that actually demonstrates gratitude. And furthermore, there's nothing in there that actually activates gratitude. They're just words. However, in the Hebrew, the word todah, which is thanks, we say todah rava. Todah rava. Now, todah rava does not mean many thanks. This is what it says. So todah is actually from the root word hod, which is glory. Okay? And so what you're doing when a person has demonstrated hospitality of some sort is you're placing upon them the blessing of glory increasing, or glory intensified. And now, so you say to a person, your hospitality has given me what I need, has given me what is needed, and I am experiencing satiety, and therefore may glory intensify upon you. So those are the words of Todah Rava. However, what actually happens within the hospitality culture of the ancient Hebrew nomads is the host is offered service by that person who has received service. How can I repay you? How can I give, right? So I'm going to pronounce a blessing because that's usually all you can afford is a blessing, right? Now, in the Hebrew, there is no word for you're welcome, but the thought process behind the word you're welcome means what? You are always welcome to my hospitality. So when somebody says thank you, you say you're welcome, you're saying I actually believe that you will always be allowed to have my resource, right? Okay. So now the way that I want you to think about this is that when it says in the Torah that after you have consumed a meal, you give thanks, what is that saying? That you bless the host. Oh, you understand this now because the host is Yahweh. So when you have consumed something, you bless the host. But here's the part about it that's crazy is that the only way that you could bless the host is by receiving. Yeah, that's another teaching, and you're not ready for that yet. Okay. So the premise is that what we need to understand then is that there is a context here when it comes to this Thanksgiving. So be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Now here's the Amplified. Do not be anxious or worried about anything, but in everything, every circumstance and situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, continue to make your specific requests known to God. Now, when Yahweh provides something to you, the way you respond is by creating an equal distribution of that thing. Okay? Consuming it first for you. Now, man, smoke must be getting worse. So basically, the way that I want you to think about this is that there is a king who gives an inheritance to his son, and the expectation is that his son is supposed to break up the kingdom and give it to all of the people. Okay, that's the premise. So the context is that you consume first, taking care of yourself, self-care, etc., etc. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? All those things. And then the rest is that you equally distribute it. Okay, so the premise is that the way in which you give thanks is you distribute it, redistribute it as you yourself received it, or pay it forward. A grateful person will find what they have and give it. And that's the way that I want you to think about it, is that you have received something, so now go give something. Well, that's part of the mechanism. However, Yeshua says, believe you have received it, which means what? You are actually supposed to do the mechanism before the process. Okay? So believing you have received it is that you go and you distribute before you actually have received. Well, this makes sense now because of the elevation and reciprocation and all that other stuff. And getting small being made big, right? That's the premise. But then it says this in the New King James, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, surpasses all the what and the why, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Okay. We won't get into the through Christ Jesus part, but I propose to you that you do not know what that means. You don't know what in Christ means, you don't know what through Christ means, and you don't know what by Christ means, okay? All right, and then on here, and the peace of God that which reassures the heart, that peace which transcends all understanding, that peace which stands guard over your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus is yours. And then look at the subtitle, meditate on these things. Okay, now this is very important. Can you meditate on that which is pure unless you know that which is impure? Can you meditate on that which is lovely unless you know that which is not lovely? Can you meditate on that which is of good report unless you understand what not having a good reputation is? Can you understand virtue unless you have seen non-virtue? Now, some people say, oh, wait, that's dualism. You're darn right. In other words, the only way for you to really understand the level of light and strength that you have is through the adversity that you go through and the endurance that you experience. The endurance of the bride, or the patience of the saints, or the endurance of the saints, is actually part of a prophetic, remember, not future predicting, but circumstance predicting timeline. Okay? Now, it is very important for you to understand that the golden calf locked into the universe something very powerful, because Israel was a holy nation, a royal priesthood and a peculiar people, a treasured people or a special treasure or a unique people or a beautiful people. Unfortunately, a nation of prophets came out of Egypt. And that nation of prophets created prophetic processes within the reality that we understand. You see, if anybody needs to understand how inappropriately the book of Leviticus is labeled, all they need to do is go read Exodus, another inappropriately labeled book, the timeline of chapter 19. In chapter 19, it says, you will be this, you'll be royal priests, you'll be you'll be royal priesthood, a holy nation, and my own special people. Then Moses goes back down the mountain and Yahweh tells him, see to it that the priests do not breach the mountain. Wait a minute. The priesthood does not actually get initiated until after the golden calf. So who are these priests? The promise or gospel or good news that was given to Moses up on the mountain when he said, if these people will do what I ask them to do, then they will be a royal priesthood. Peter says you have become a royal priesthood, which means what? You've had the Sinai experience. But here's the part that is so very, very powerful. And that is that they actually established something when they did the golden calf. Who joins with Moses to bring about the correction for the golden calf? The Levites do. Now, there's two very important elements to this. Number one is that Levi, very inappropriately with his brother Simeon, murdered circumcised or Abrahamically covenanted people in the promised land. Now, here's the irony. They tell the man that he needs to become circumcised in order for there to be any covenant between them. But what you don't realize is that circumcision is the sign of the land covenant between God and Abraham and his descendants. The only way that somebody can inherit the land of Israel is to have been circumcised. So now Levi goes along and kills these men after they have been circumcised, after they have entered into covenant. It was so loathsome of an act in the Middle East to break or breach a covenant in that way that Jacob said that he had become putrid in the nostrils of the peoples of the land. Now, in that whole process, now Levi comes along and he cleanses the Israelites of those who had worshiped and had done the things with the golden calf. Which means what? There were those who didn't participate. But nevertheless, because the people just could not handle the idea of themselves being, because they were slaves and they had been taught that they were slaves, that's going to become important in a minute. They were taught that they were slaves. They were given that context, that's what their person was. They could not handle not having a master and being masters themselves. And here's the crazy part about it is what Moses was trying to teach them in the desert. Let me rephrase that. What Yahweh was trying to teach them through Moses in the desert was that they were Elohim, that they were gods. Now, here's the part that's important. When you get your mind wrapped around this, you will understand that what they did here established a timeline in the reality of humanity because of how powerful they were. You see, this wasn't just a simple creation of a statue and an orgy. It was something else. It was an activation of a reality. Because why? Because they knew how to do it the way that it is supposed to be done. They knew that they could set up and create a portal by which they could activate energies inappropriately. But that affected humanity throughout the history of humanity until now. How dangerous is that? And so now we say, well, what is this? Well, they say it's a false god, right? He says, you shall have no false gods before me, or false gods in my face. Well, there's an intrigue to that, and that is in its simplicity. There is actually only one Elohim that is relevant to a relationship between God and us, and that's us. We are the false gods that he doesn't want in his face. When are we the false gods? When we create a false reality by meditating upon it. But how? This is how, okay? A combination of your wounds, your entitlements, and your limiting beliefs, and your lack of imagination. When I say lack of imagination, there's something you need to know. You're absolutely using your imagination. When do you use your imagination? When you meditate. Upon what? Upon your fears and your doubts. Now, where this becomes very, very, very important is what fear is. Fear is an imagination. But when we are processing fear in our lives, what we do is we imagine a possible outcome about the future that may or may not happen and is not determined, but it could become very much manifest in your life. I'll show you how in a minute, because the same way that you actually activate what Yeshua said is the same way you activate fear, which is spell casting. Let me explain. So in spell casting, when a person activates a spell, what they do is they create a circumstance by which they act out something, okay? And in that process of acting out, they set intention. And when they set intention, the way in which they activate the magic behind it is that they actually act out the thing through some form of ritual using objects as symbolic representations. Now, this is extremely important and a part of reality that you really need to get your mind wrapped around and get your reality checked. And that is that what you focus on is what will become your reality, but you need to understand that you actually need to walk within that focus. And you do. You make little micro adjustments in your fear, creating a spell. You make little micro adjustments in your fear, creating a spell. A spell that affects all of reality around you. Okay? Now, on the one side, we have the law of attraction. Let's explain how this works. Like kind attracts like kind. So now, if you are actually in a situation where you are acting a certain way, you are creating a spell. Let me explain. So the premise is that whether it is true or not, this thing that you fear or the activation of these fears, what actually is happening is the little micro adjustments you're making are acting. Why? Because that is not the actual reality. That future doesn't exist. but you are already acting out the motions of it by adjusting your little micro adjustments to your fears that you meditated on while you were driving to work and didn't even realize you were meditating on it, because true meditation requires intention, which is what he's talking about in Philippians 4, which I'll explain in a minute. He says, be anxious for nothing. You don't know how much anxiety you actually have as a result of the fears that you construct in your mind and make micro adjustments for, thereby acting a certain way. And what? That action, that false God, is actually going to attract like kind to like kind. You are actually creating that reality, because the universe itself is obedient. Remember what the universe does. The universe conspires on your behalf to be unconditionally obedient to the sons of Adam. Okay? So if that's true, you tell the universe, I want this to happen. That's what's going to happen. How do you tell the universe? You don't tell the universe, I want this to happen, by just speaking it, because you know what? We flippantly say stuff. Have you ever been in an argument with somebody and said, I wish you were dead? Has that person just died in that instant? Some have. But you get my point. You didn't actually mean that, right? You don't actually desire that person to expire. It's an expression of a lot of betrayal and pain and other things that are coming out of your heart in that moment. So the universe doesn't just go off of words, the universe goes off of actions. And as you do those actions, you are going to attract like kind. Now, here's the part, that's the attraction part. So the other side of that is that there is a concept or an idea that you also are actually moving the energies with your mind through meditation. Now, I realize that might be really, really hard to swallow, because you don't think about those things as a Christian. As a Christian, you don't say, how can I actually move or activate the Holy Spirit? Unless, of course, you're Assemblies of God, and then there's kind of a demand that you speak in tongues in order to activate the Holy Spirit. But the premise is that basically the way that you think is that the Holy Spirit is something that you've got to have to kind of invoke, or that the Holy Spirit is something that you actually have to kind of, open yourself to. Well, you're not wrong, but I want you to think about it a little bit different. The Holy Spirit is not this sovereign, extreme authority over you, but instead is a mechanism by which you have power. You say, isn't that sacrilegious or blasphemous? No, because I want you to think about when Abraham encountered Yahweh in Genesis chapter 18 in Vayera. In Vayera, Yahweh walks by, and it appears as though he's going to pass by Abraham's tent. Abraham is sitting in the cool of the day in his tent, or maybe it's the heat of the day, in his tent, right? Meditating. And what happens? Yahweh acts like he's going to pass by. And so he calls to Yahweh and asks him to come in and to receive from him. And he offers the best of the food. There were two very, 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 very important delicacies in the Middle East during the time of the nomads. And that was cheese curd, because it could be made in the desert. And the second was veal, which was a very, very delicate meat. So he offers these delicacies to Yahweh, the fatted calf and the curds. And of course, then after that, then Yahweh says, where is your wife Sarah? Why is Yahweh doing that? Because he's following the tradition of the nomads. Hospitality equates to a blessing. A blessing will always bring about an initiation of process. But watch this. The only way in which that could have been activated is through the actions, right? And so even though that we're dealing with the intensification of all power in the universe, we're dealing with Yahweh, and he's talking to Abraham and discussing these things and working with him. Yahweh says, at the time of life next year, I will visit again. Which means what? He's going to come back again, and that's when there's actually going to be an activation of this thing. Okay, so there's a few things that are very important. When Yahweh made a covenant with Abraham and said, through your seed shall all of the world be blessed, Abraham does his whole thing with Hagar, which is a form of a golden calf, but we'll deal with that because we can definitely see the conflict between the two brothers still to this day, between Isaac's children and Ishmael's children. Okay. And so when we are working with political models and we're working with geographic models, we need to realize that that is exactly what happened with Hagar. But now it's very important that as we go through this process, we realize that it says Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Okay? Now, the reason why I bring this up is because what you need to understand is Abraham had to activate his faith through his action. A crisis of belief occurs, etc. If you want a really good reference, and let me tell you something, I really don't like Southern Baptists, okay? But I can tell you, I have had a life-changing experience with the Experiencing God series, with the workbook and going through the videos and all that. It was a long, long time ago for me. But it right in there says that God's invitation for you to join him will always result in a crisis of belief, because it will be a God-sized task. But here's the part that's crazy. His invitation to join him will be a crisis belief that requires faith in action. It's right here in front of you. That is the purest form of manifestation instruction I have ever seen. Okay? But so what is it? The meditation creates the perception or the paradigm by which the actions will occur. So the meditation part is the part by which you focus upon something. But then you start to make your micro adjustments because you have focused on it. Now, when you focus upon it and you start making those micro adjustments, you are doing the same thing that the workers of darkness do when they are building and activating spells. You are acting out. What does Yeshua say? He says, believe you have received. What does that mean? That means that you need to offer service and Todah Rabbah, offer to lay light upon. And the way in which you do that is you go and you give what you can. Remember the widow who came along and dropped two widow mites into the thing? Widow mites aren't worth anything. They would just be given back to the widows. It was like food stamps. Okay? And so the premise that I want you to think about is the widow drops those widow mites in there. Who's she giving to? Other widows, right? And so the premise is that what I want you to think about is there's always something you can give, and that activates the process of receiving, okay? Which is a reciprocation. Remember, the entire feast day season is an activation of judgment, which is actually harvest, reaping what you've sown. But what you don't realize is the way in which that occurs is through meditation. Now, it can be brief, it can be momentary, or it can be a long drawn out process. But Paul says, set your intentional meditation. Don't be anxious. Don't be in a trance, focusing on something that has not occurred and you don't know if it's going to occur. I can tell you, I've had some circumstances in my life where I was so afraid and I was making micro adjustments. And when I was afraid and making those micro adjustments, I was telling the universe exactly what I wanted. And no matter what I did, I could not focus on anything else. There was no other thing I could focus on. And I can tell you the only thing that I knew to do was ask for mercy. I was so scared. And truth be told is not only did it not happen, but I lost months of time of meditation and months of time of activation to that fear. And when I tell you this, I'm telling you it was so bad I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. So I laid through the night meditating over and over on the same exact circumstance and how it was going to go down. And I kid you not, I sat there and I would wake up, or I wouldn't wake up, but I would get up in the morning and I would be tired, but I couldn't sleep. Because the moment I start to fall asleep, I would start to dream about it. It was so scary and I was so fearful. And I can tell you, it consumed my life. Well, Paul gave us instructions to do exactly the opposite of that. But what I want you to understand is if you meditate on that which is pure, you need to understand impure. You need to know that there is actually an impure thought within you. Which brings me to the final points of this message. And I've thought a lot, and I don't prepare messages, but I've thought a lot about what this actually is that I was realizing was the message this week. In the end, what has happened is that when we have focused on that which we should not focus on, we've meditated upon that which we should not meditate upon and made our micro adjustments, we actually have lied to ourselves. We have created false things, okay? So where do we need to get honest? Well, there are a number of areas, okay? So let's talk about those areas. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to colorize these. And the reason I am is because I feel like it would be important to kind of keep them in their own categories. So we'll just start with that color, just randomly start with that color. Maybe not randomly, who knows? So number one is we need to get honest about money. Okay? Number two is we need to get honest about relationships. Okay? Let's see. Money, relationships. What else would we need to be honest about? Yeah, let's be honest about. We need to be honest about our, let's see, money, relationships. Let's say stewardships. Stewardships. Oh yeah, that's for. Let's say we stick with those three right now. There might be another one come up, but I think That's where we need to be with it. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to talk about relationships, okay? Um, love is a very flippant word, and love is a unfortunate anomaly within humans. I'm gonna share something with you guys that I don't think you realize, and that is that um, just because there is a sentiment, um, the concept here is just because you think emotionally about somebody doesn't necessarily mean that you love them. And what I want to do is help you understand that love is an actual emotional attachment and not a sentiment, but that love will always result in action. Okay. And I'm going to propose to you that when you love someone, you action that love with them. Now, we could get into all kinds of things. We could get into love languages and nuances of personality and all these other things. But truth be told, if you were to get honest with yourself, if you fall in love with somebody, you do certain things. Now, here's where we need to start to get honest. Do you still do those things? Because if you don't, I propose to you that it has gone from love to principle. And if you are in a relationship, a friendship, a family connection, a spouse, a significant other, a even could be coworker, that's a little bit reduced, obviously. You have some form of love action that you do to demonstrate what you are experiencing emotionally. Because remember, all emotions are hormones, and I can give you the list of hormones that are involved with love. All right. But what you don't realize is that if you have become stagnant in those actions, it's very possible that you actually have fallen out of love with the person and you're staying with them on principle because of a belief that that's the value that you're supposed to have, etc., etc. Usually, this is a result of resentments, and those resentments can carry for years. As somebody who has coached couples, I can tell you that I have encountered wounds that occurred on the wedding night, wounds that occurred during courtship, right? 10, 15 years later, still there. And now the extra resentments along with that wound have created an inaction. Okay. So one of the places we need to, one of the places where we need to stop lying to ourselves is our relationships. Are we actually still connected to the person, or are we there on principle because that's what's supposed to happen? If you actually were to look at all the golden calves that you have created concerning your marriage, which are what? Activations of spells to compensate for the deficit of the things that you don't do anymore, then you're not actually still connected, and you're operating off a principle and logic. And I propose to you that if you really got your mind wrapped around reality, you would understand that the only way that you can stay in that circumstance is to reinitiate those actions, which means that you would have to accept that the resentments that have built up in you are actually conditionally removing the actions. When you fell in love with the person, or when you felt love for the person, and now I want you to realize I'm not just talking about men and women here. I'm talking about friendships. Look at David. David loved Jonathan more than he had love for a woman. That's a relationship. And there is a love connection there that resulted in actions of love. And that never ceased even after Jonathan died. In fact, David even offered special things to Jonathan's son in order to compensate for the factor of love that he felt for Jonathan. David tried so hard to come into a consideration that maybe Jonathan would rule some of the kingdom and David would rule some of the kingdom. And Jonathan was like, nope, that's not what God said, dude. I have to go. So when I talk about this, I'm not just talking about a marriage, or I am not just talking about a husband and a wife, or a mother and a daughter, or a cousin and a cousin. I'm talking about all relationships, because remember, a relationship, the word itself means that you would create a return back and forth. So you're returning to the person. Are you returning to the person on principle, or are you returning to the person because there's still a desire to do those actions? You see, the Hebrew language is an amazing language, but one of the things that people don't realize is one of the reasons why Yahweh chose it is because there are no nouns in the language. Nouns are just modified verbs. Remember when I talked about how the word ropheh means healing, but the word ropheh also means doctor, and the word ropheh also means medicine, and the word so basically any version of the context of healing is contained within the word, and that's a noun. Ropheh is a noun. It means doctor in Hebrew. But ropheh is also the ing of the word rapha, which is what? He healed. So he is healing is ropheh. What's my point? My point is that we are action-oriented Elohim. We will do things. Why do you think a worker of darkness spreads a big old tapestry over a table that contains symbols and has a bowl and candles and other elements that are symbolic of what they're trying to activate? They're acting it out because they know that's how magic works. What is magic? It's an activation of energies. Those activation of energies is just a reality part of being Elohim. We are eternal beings having a human experience. We're not humans having a spiritual experience. We are super powerful, eternal beings. The Bible, and Christianity for that matter, does not contend with that fact. Christianity does not contend with the idea that we are ancient, or that we will be very, very, very ancient in the future. In fact, Christianity, in its eternal conscious punishment, proposes that the soul never dies, that the soul never actually expires, but could be in eternal conscious punishment. Meaning what? Forever suffering. As opposed to a soul who is in a state of heavenly bliss for eternity. There is no questioning that in Christianity. And yet at the same time, we don't accept that that means we are very, very, very powerful, supernatural beings. Are we the intensification of all power in the universe? No, we're kind of a dumbed down version of it. But we still are it. And the irony is in the fact that the time when that breaks down is when somebody begins to question. Somebody says, "Oh, wait a minute. I think I understand in this a certain way," and so then they go to the pastor and they ask him questions, and the pastor's like, "No, that's not how you're supposed to think. See, you're thinking the wrong way. You're thinking like a New Ager, or you're thinking like a person who doesn't believe in God. Here's the theology." A theology that was established by people who intentionally suppressed information, intentionally did not want the people knowing the things that you need to know. You know, the biggest display of this that I see in our time is the First Amendment auditors. The First Amendment auditors have basically educated themselves in the law more than law enforcement. And then they will go and they will confront law enforcement and show that law enforcement is uneducated, and therefore they are not they're not being trained well. And incompetence can play a huge role in the rights of a human being being violated by somebody who thinks they have the authority and the right to do those things when they don't. Well, that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about here. It's a perfect example. When a person starts to educate themselves, and immediately they're told, "Oh no, that's not what Augustine said." Well, who is Augustine? And what right does he have in Protestant Christianity anyways? He was a Catholic. I'll tell you what right he has in Protestant Christianity. Who started Protestantism? An Augustinian monk. Whoa, there's a shocker. Of course, Augustine's going to have precedence. His benevolent order was the founder of Christianity, Protestant Christianity. American Protestant Christianity is founded by an Augustinian monk. So of course Augustine is going to get precedence in original sin and Trinity and all the other hogwash that's been brought down into your faith, into your religion. We need to get honest with ourselves about money. What do I mean by that? I mean that we have a tendency to lie to ourselves about our financial state. When we have money, we think that we think that means that we can spend it. But when we don't have money, we think that we can't spend it. When the truth is that the provision and protection and instruction comes from Yahweh, right? And so technically speaking, there is an unending bank account of resources that you can spend. But see, we don't think that way, and we don't have that. The first thing that we do when we see money is we say, "Oh, you know what? We can't afford that." When the truth is that the reason why there are people more elite and more wealthy than you is because they don't say, "I can't afford that." They figure out how to afford that. And the irony is that they also figure out whether or not it's going to make them any money. Half of the stuff that you can't afford because your mind's actually telling you you don't need that because it is actually not going to make you any money. It's going to depreciate. It's going to sit in your garage and you're going to end up selling it 2 years later for half the price that it was to begin with. When I talk about getting honest with money, what I mean is do you really actually believe that you are the one who earns that paycheck? You need to be honest with yourself and realize that if you believe that God is the provider, you can't be the provider. That's a golden calf. That's a golden calf. Don't get me wrong, you need to go through the action of earning, right? We need to go through the action of producing income. But don't think for a second that you are the reason why you have food on the table. You're not. Yeah, you went to the grocery store and spent your paycheck, but truth be told, there are people who have food on their table who did not get a paycheck this week because somebody was an equal distributor. I told you I was going to talk about color grading. And the way that I want you to think about this is that activate when you activate an initiation of meditation, like I said, you create that attraction, right? Of like kind attracting like kind, even though you're acting, you're not actually actioning reality. You're actioning an imagination of something that you're afraid of, right? Your meditation as you drove to work and thought about all the fearful things and all the stressful things. You know, stress is just fear. That's all it is. In fact, I can tell you everything. Anger, stress, most negative emotions are the result of fear. And I can tell you that those emotions are activated by a very specific list that we don't have an infinite amount of hormones in our body. We have about, I think it's in the hundreds, but we have some very specific hormones attached to emotion, and there are some huge emotions attached to fear. I'm sorry, huge hormones attached to fear. But the thing is that when you meditate upon it and you do that action, now you've acted it out. You've activated a spell. But here's the crazy part about it. The other side of this is the fact that you have created a filter by which you look at reality. Okay? And here's where you really need to get honest with yourself. There's a why behind the why. So when you're afraid of something happening, you don't realize that that fear is an imagination that you're supposed to be using to manifest good things in your life intentionally. Remember, believe you have received it, and remember that the object or the action of giving thanks beforehand is not words but actions, an activation of the light, as it were. In other words, you activate the spell of bringing about the process. You're doing that with fear. But now watch this. And so really fear is witchcraft, right? I mean, when we're looking at this in the appropriate light or lens, because the optics say that a witch alters natural order processes of nature and the universe in order to influence human behavior for a malevolent purpose. Balak, a witch king, comes to Balaam, a prophet of Yahweh, and says, I need you to curse this people who have come into my land. Now, why? How would he know that Balaam is actually able to do this? Track record, right? How would he know that Balaam was that powerful? Track record. And so what happens now? Here comes Balaam, and he does the things that we know. He blesses Israel. How beautiful are the tents of Jacob and the tabernacles of Israel, right? The Matavu, beautiful song. And so what I'm trying to tell you is that all witchcraft is the activation of those things, and all prophecy is the activation of things for a non-malevolent or a benevolent purpose. Okay? And so the way I want you to understand it is that when we come along as priests, as a peculiar people, as a holy nation, holy being energized, right? There is a concept or an ideal built into it that you are powerful and that the universe is being obedient to you. But now watch this. The other side of this is about a belief, either a reinforced belief or a belief that's activated in those moments, and it will always come back to a why behind a why. Why were the Israelites afraid of being killed by the Amalekites and the Nephilim, where they were grasshoppers in their eyes, and that their children were going to become a prey, which means what? They were going to be sacrificed to false gods. That's what the Israelites said about what was going to happen if they went into the promised land during the golden calf season. And only Joshua and Caleb had maintained their faith through intentional meditation. Because here's the deal. The people say, oh, you know what? We're grasshoppers in their eyes. Good, you got small. Great. Now Yahweh can work. Right? That's the crazy part about this thing. But what was the why behind the why? Obviously, a belief that they, A, had to do it themselves, golden calf, B, that they could not trust Yahweh, the provider, the protector, and the instructor. You want to know one of the biggest reasons why Christianity has rejected Torah? Because they don't trust God. They think they do. They believe they do. They love Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5. But the truth be told is that if there was really a trust in God, then they would walk out his instructions from Torah without fear. I actually have a friend who will not step into Torah because of his fear of what his family members are going to think of him. Because if he steps into Torah and activates it, then he has to react a certain way to family members' choices. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that when we look at the why behind the why, we start to look at lenses. And so in color grading, when you are doing video editing, you color grade in order to create emotion. And the truth is that all that's happening is a filter is being put over the camera lens that alters the color of the entire reality in front of you. And so a good example of this is the movie Matrix, which had a green filter throughout its entire filming. But the premise is very, very important that should not be missed, and that is that a filter is placed over the lens. That filter is that fear filter. Now you are looking at reality in that color instead of the reality that is actually true. So what is the reality? And when I say this, what I'm saying is what can we trust if we can't trust the Word of God? If the Word of God says something about our reality and we look at it differently, then of course we are going to make micro adjustments along those lines. No wonder Christianity is so screwed up. It's a result of a bunch of ego-driven reality makers who believed that that's actually the best thing for the people. You guys don't realize that your religion in and of itself was established by people who thought you couldn't handle your connection to God. You couldn't handle the power, the energy. And so they made you afraid of it. And they made you believe that you had to go through certain hoops to have it or to activate it. When truth be told is you are the reason behind it in the first place, because you are an Elohim. The kingdom of heaven is within you. Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and all of its righteousness. What's righteousness? Equal distribution of wealth, which means you need to be wealthy. Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and all of its riches so that you can give it away. And that is within you, which means what? Those energies within you need to be equally distributed. You don't get to pick and choose who you want to distribute that to. We need to get honest with our stewardships. Let's take a look at that one. And I'm sure there's some areas that I've neglected. Maybe they'll come out in Midrash. But what are we talking about when we're talking about stewardships? since I need to reference the golden calf as much, I'll just leave it on this screen. But we need to get honest with our stewardships. What's a stewardship? A stewardship is when you are entrusted with something by somebody. Doesn't necessarily have to be somebody in authority, just somebody who's willing to trust you with the thing. You call a friend, hey buddy, can I borrow your truck? I need to move a couch from this place to this place, right? So now what has happened? You have been entrusted. You've been given the keys to the vehicle. You go and get the couch and you take it to its destination. You've been entrusted with that vehicle. In that moment, you do not own that vehicle, but you are responsible as if you did. So what? You are not an owner. You are a steward. And in the same way, you are not a driver. You are a steward. Right? You're not the driver of that vehicle. You don't pay the insurance on it. You don't own the title to it, right? And so the premise is that stewardships are just things where we have been entrusted with things. Let me tell you some stewardships. A motherhood is a stewardship. That's right. You're not a mother. It never actually says that you're a mother. It says you've been entrusted as a mother. Okay? You've been entrusted with the responsibility, which is what? Your ability to respond to the raising of the child, right? Responsibility being what? Proactive response, an intentional response to raising the child. That's a stewardship. When you start to think that you're a mother, this will happen. Because the moment that you start to think that you're the sovereign of the thing that you have been loaned in order to give process to, it's not your truck. You borrowed the truck. Okay? Don't get me wrong. There are chemical processes that cause you to be very bound and very connected to and very responsible for your child. But don't think for a second that it is actually your identity. It is not. It is a stewardship. So we need to get honest about stewardships. We need to realize that there's a context of trust. And if there's a time where that no longer is needed for you to be the trusted steward of that thing, you need to allow Yahweh to take it back out of your life. Now that can be difficult and that can cause pain because of those chemicals that cause you to feel bonded and etc. But you need to understand that if it's in your life, you are a steward of it. If it's not in your life, then that stewardship has been removed. Acceptance of that reality instead of trying to convince yourself that you have an entitlement to it is absolutely important. You need to accept that it is a stewardship. That is true of all of your property, your business ventures, all of your endeavors. You drive to a place with a desire to accomplish a certain expectation. For example, you go to the lake, you're going to go fishing, you get ate by mosquitoes and you get mad. Well, truth be told, that was a stewardship. That was, you don't own the lake. So your expectations concerning the lake should not have had a disappointment. The mosquitoes were there before you were. But in our minds, we are entitled to the lake because we expected to experience a certain thing. I have this happen to me all the time when I'm camping. I'll go camping and I'll have an expectation of a certain emotional experience or spiritual experience, and I won't have it, so I'll be disappointed. There are people who long to go on the camping trips I go on. People who long to own the equipment that I own for camping, and yet I don't have that moment of gratitude that occurred. I have a disappointment of my expectation, which consequently was an inappropriate meditation in the first place very similar to fear. It's imagination about the future that may or may not occur. I need to accept that it may or may not occur. Oh, what a lovely thing that we could accept that fear may or may not occur, right? I'm afraid that if I let my child go and hang out with this family, that he's going to be influenced, and then he might not turn out the way that I would like him to, right? And so I'm not going to let him hang out. And that fear was actioned by not allowing it. But here's the interesting thing about it. In that moment of having that fear, you have no idea what influence they might have had upon your child. So true. We go into situations with expectation and we're disappointed, but the truth is all the expectation was an imagination about the future that may or may not occur. But let me tell you where you fail. You fail miserably in your dishonesty with yourself about what you actually are entitled to. Now, there has two elements to this. The one side is the chip on your shoulder where you feel like you deserve something you don't. You don't realize that that in and of itself was a stewardship or is a stewardship. And if you are trusted with it, great. If you're not, then too bad. Okay? But the premise is that we will feel like we deserve something because of what we've went through, or we'll feel like we deserve certain treatment because of what we experience emotionally, or we will feel like we have some sort of, augmentation to the rules. You know, the core of a criminal mind is a belief that they deserve to break the law because of the bad that's happened to them. That is the core of a criminal mind. Now, there's some other things that go into that, obviously, wounds, limiting beliefs, etc. But the truth is that, for example, we will be late because we screwed around and did something, that caused us to be late, and we'll break the speed limit. I've done this before, probably within this last week, even speeded because we were late or because I was late to something. And the truth is I wasn't entitled to break the speed limit. And then we get all bent out of shape when the cop pulls us over in the first place. Come on, I wasn't really going that fast. Well, wait a minute. Anything over that speed limit is going that fast, right? So when I'm talking about entitlement in this context, I'm talking about what you're supposed to believe that you are entitled to as a peculiar people, a treasured people, as a royal priesthood, as a holy nation. All of Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 1 through 14 apply to those who activate it within their faith. Do you even believe? Remember the why behind the why. Remember this filter that we place upon the camera, and it affects everything. If there's anything you can say about the movie The Matrix, is when they wanted you to feel a disgust for the scene, you felt it as a result of the filter on the camera. And so there was this dis-ease, there was this uneasiness during the movie, and it was designed that way. The scenes, the camera angles, all that was designed to make you feel that uneasiness. And so the way that I want you to understand this is that we'll create that filter of expectation, that filter of fear, and we'll look at all of the rest of our reality that way. Because here's the interesting thing about it. At the core of your fear is the opinion of yourself. At the core of your fear is a twisted reality. Because at the core of your fear is a belief that you won't be protected, a belief that you don't deserve to have the justice or the prosperity or the other thing that is creating the fear in the first place. When truth be told is you absolutely deserve those things because you were created in the first place. If you're created, then you're valuable. Nobody makes anything that they don't appreciate. They just wad it up and throw it away. I will oftentimes find crumbled up paper in the trash can, but you can see it wasn't, it was like a drawing that was being made, or a letter that was being written, and now it's in the trash can because the person who was writing it decided that that was not what they wanted to actually communicate. Which means what? They didn't actually want to bring it into reality. So they threw it away because it's not valuable to them. But then when I have a drawing on my end table, I realize that somebody went to the lengths that they went to create it because they value it. So the drawings that are discarded in the trash can, I know aren't the valuable ones, but the one that's actually presented into reality is the valuable one. So if you were created, if you're here, you were valuable. But that's not enough for you, is it? It's not enough for me to say that to you. You need to feel valuable. But the truth is the reason you don't feel valuable is because of what you focus on. And the truth is that you don't feel valuable because of what you actually already believe about yourself. And so even if somebody does try to validate that for you, you don't believe it. I can tell a person that they are precious over and over and over again. But if they don't believe it about themselves, they are never going to be precious. In fact, people will treat them preciously and they will take offense or they will become reactive. They will look for the ulterior motive. Why are they doing that? Because they themselves don't believe themselves to be that. If you are told your whole life that you were a peasant and that you could never be a king, and when royalty rides by and you have to step out of the way, you would never in a million years climb into that chariot thinking you have a right to be a king. But if you were told that if later on in life you were told actually you were born royalty and that you need to come to the palace, it would be a shock to your system. It's not supposed to be a shock to your system. You are Elohim. We are the highest thing in this realm. We are the light of the world, and we are not supposed to suppress it or put it under a bushel. And so taking that lens off the camera and allowing the natural truth to be present and then augmenting it is the power of the saint. It is the right and privilege and expectation from Yahweh of the bride to think herself a bride and to treat herself like a bride of the intensification of all power in the universe. The endurance that she has here is, did he really go to prepare a place? Is there really going to be some powerful awakening at Yom Teruah? I want you to think about the Jews who sit down at the table at Passover with an empty plate next to them. And during the ceremony of the Seder, there's a ceremony, right? And acting out. What's the acting out? They get up from the table, they go to the door, and they open the door because Elijah might be standing there. And Elijah has to come first before the Messiah. Jews who do not believe in Jesus Christ, do not believe in Yeshua HaMashiach, go to the door and look for Elijah. I've always painted this picture where Zechariah and Elizabeth are sitting down to have their Passover Seder meal, and they put the cup of Elijah and they put the plate of Elijah there, and John, who's been gone for years, comes in from the wilderness and sits down at the table where it's already been prepared for him and starts eating the meal, and them two are just looking at him with shock. I've always tried to paint that picture with my congregation. But the premise or the idea is that they're acting out a concept of faith. That's how we are supposed to walk this out. You look at reality correctly. There is a why behind the why, and there is an intentional action going on. Remember, there were two things that actually result when you are afraid. The first is you do something. The second is you believe something. Both of them are an intention and an action that is a ritual and therefore is a spell, which means fear is witchcraft. Remember, witchcraft is the altering natural order processes of nature and the universe to influence human behavior for a malevolent purpose. Whereas the actions of a prophet alter natural order processes of nature and of the universe to affect human behavior for benevolent purposes. So whereas fear is witchcraft, what's the opposite of fear? Well, according to these words, let me read them to you again. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Be anxious for nothing. Don't be afraid. It is not a reality to think about the future, activate actions about it, and expect anything other than what you meditated, focused on, and actioned upon. Because of the law of attraction, manifestation, Yeshua is saying, if you ask for something and believe you receive it, you will receive it. Right? And Yeshua says, give thanks as if you already have it. This is not about trying to fake emotion. People who are doing manifestation rituals, who are pretending, are never going there. That's just this. They're never going to actually accomplish the thing. But boy, when we get into fear, boy, are we good at it. So the reason why he's saying here, meditate on these things, finally, believers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable and worthy of respect. Well, how would you know what's honorable and worthy of respect if you didn't know what was dishonorable and not worthy of respect? Whatever is right and confirmed by God's word, right? Whatever is pure and wholesome, whatever is lovely and brings peace, whatever is admirable and of good repute, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think continually on these things. Center your mind on them and implant them in your heart. The things which you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things in daily life, and the God who is the source of peace and well-being will be with you. I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that now at last you have renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned about me before, but you have had no opportunity to show it. Which is what? An action. An action. It's all contextually lined up in Philippians 4. To say, hey, look, when you meditated upon this and actioned it, now I feel like you have concern for me. Your meditation will be in a state of a trance. Let me tell you one of the things that is absolutely destructive to the Christian: disassociation. Disassociation is a false reality. Disassociation is a part of what? Not addressing reality correctly. It's a lens filter. The optics of reality are what they are, but there are that in this moment. Doesn't mean they're going to stay that way, but your meditations about them could potentially make it that way. Because the universe is going to be obedient to the sons of Adam. Get over it. That's just how it works. But you need to understand there's a why behind the why. There's a filter on that camera that you need to take off. Because if you think for a minute that the reason why you're afraid of something is because you deserve to be punished, guess what? You will be punished. But if you understand that people make mistakes and there are solutions and there are ways to renew your mind so you don't make the mistake again, and there are ways to recompense and give restitution, then guess what? That's it. There is no other requirement of you, because he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. It was never about your merit to begin with. No matter how bad you screw up, you still have that label. You think about some of the psychopaths of our time, and I'm going to tell you right now, Yeshua did not get off the cross because of them. He stayed there on the cross because of them. It wasn't a cross, but you Christians have to understand it how you have to understand it. He stayed on the cross for Jeffrey Dahmer, right? He stayed on the cross for Hitler. Guess what? Hitler was the righteousness of God. You ready for that one? No, you're not. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Does that mean he walked in that identity? No, he was a horrible human. He was, but he still had that identity just like you do. And you probably haven't done anything even remotely as atrocious as some of the things that some of the psychopaths of our time have done. So you need to get over yourself a bit as well, because truth be told is your sin is not that big. But the bigger your sin in your mind, the more punishment you want to draw to yourself. You need to quiet that heart. And you need to begin to meditate upon things of the future and activate them the way that you're supposed to, not in this witchcraft manner that you work with. Well, this was a long message, and I know that there's a lot that we necessarily need to get into. And I know some of the things that belong on this list I did not address today, but you need to understand that this list right here is just a little bit the tip of the iceberg of what you need to get honest with about your reality. Because truth be told is until you accept your reality in this time, not in the future, then you can begin to augment it and alter it. Remember that I taught in the past, within like the past 3 videos, I have basically said, look, whatever's happening at this moment is what is supposed to happen. However, every single time that you feel discomfort, you will try to alter it, which means what? We're supposed to alter it, which means that's not what it's supposed to be. That's why I said, when I said, hey, look, prayer is a violation of God's will. Anytime you pray and ask God to do something other than what's happening at that moment, what happened at that moment is exactly what was supposed to happen. But what you don't understand is you're right as an Elohim to augment it. Your very existence as somebody who prays a prayer for a person who's on their deathbed that they might not die is actually violating the will of God, because the will of God is whatever is actually happening. Okay? But what you don't understand is that you are allowed to alter that, which means you need to really lose that mentality that unless I'm in God's will, I'm in violation. You need to actually start to do something with that life that you've been given and start augmenting the reality into the things that actually are meant to be the prosperity of humanity. If you truly want to be the change that this world needs, you need to start with the why behind the why and an understanding of the attraction, and get over the ridiculousness of being afraid of or not going near or having some sort of offense because there's a misunderstanding in the people of how the energies work or what they're supposed to do. Yahweh doesn't sit there and watch you read your Bible through a year and get mad because you read Torah and don't activate it. He gets mad because you don't do what it is that Yeshua instructed you to do, and you have come up with your own religion, what's right in your own eyes. And truth is he doesn't get mad because he doesn't have emotional deficits and fears. In fact, if you really understood the wrath of God, you would know that it actually means the long suffering or the patience of God, the endurance, the willingness to put up with us. It's not the wrath of God that leads us to repentance anyways. It's the kindness of God through guilt. We feel horrible when we get something that we don't deserve. And it's humbling. So this season is about endurance. It's about not allowing, look, this point right here is when they allowed their ego to have full rule. When the truth is that what they needed to be doing is following the green line. They loved the green line here. They loved the spiritual revelation and the other things that satisfied them, the manna, the water from the rock, the victory over the Amalekites with Joshua in Moses' arms. And they loved all that, but they couldn't stand waiting. And they couldn't stand getting small. What they needed to do was get small. What you need to do in this season is get small. And the way you get small is by emptying yourself, which means you go and you give. And that's just how it works. That's the mechanism of the universe. That's the context of the universe. We've worked hard, us people, to convince ourselves that things are true, that they're messages from God, and that we are supposed to go in this direction and do this thing. In fact, we've thought it about relationships, we've thought it about ministries, we've thought it about jobs, we've thought it about the direction we're supposed to go with our children, we've thought it about our how, where we're supposed to live. We've done so much to lie to ourselves when our intuition is really telling us the truth, and we just don't want to hear it because it's so uncomfortable, because we're not willing to take the time to let him prepare the space. The time, the space, the dimension, and the energy are being prepared. The things that follow the wilderness season are being prepared. And so, if there was a way to sum up this message, it's that you have been doing everything wrong. You are disassociating from reality. And in those meditations, you are creating your future. You're focusing on the wrong things, not what Paul told you to focus on. And truth be told, is you've experienced enough in your life that you actually know those moments that you need to be meditating on, you need to be focusing on. See yourself in that moment that you receive and experience that and create that as your lens filter and use that as your lens filter. Be worthy because you're not worthy. In other words, it was never about that. So just consider yourself there. You are seated in high places because of Yeshua's actions. No other reason. The light of Passover is the light of Messiah. The blessings of Passover that come all the way through this season system are all about meritlessness. Yahweh says, I didn't bring you out of Egypt because you were a great people. You were not even a people. I brought you out of Egypt because I made a promise, and I brought you out of Egypt because I love you. Sorry, you can't do anything about that. You need to focus on the right thing. Do not focus on the negative, or you will draw to yourself negative because you will make micro adjustments. I promise you, you will. Do not focus on the loss. Focus on what's coming. Do not focus on the defeat. Focus on the victory that's coming. Because that's what Yeshua, your Messiah, told you to do. This is not some New Age guru stuff written in some book that's this thick. This is a simple verse in Mark spoken by your Messiah. That you would activate it. Activate the spell by doing the intention, by speaking the thing and acting out the thing. Because you do it all the time with your fears already. You already are practicing the thing that you were told from the pulpit not to practice. So why don't you alter your reality and begin to activate the mechanisms correctly? Shabbat Shalom.